I welcome Professor Khan and Professor Gangopadhyay, of course, and other distinguished visitors, guests, my friends and colleagues, to this very interesting seminar, which we all look forward to. Let me just briefly tell a few things about Professor Khan. I wouldn't be able to, I'm sure, say all the things that he's done, but Professor Khan is currently a distinguished professor of economics at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies in the University of Denver. He has also been he has been visiting professors and fellows at various universities and institutions, including Tokyo University, Hitotsubashi University, Chelbard People's University in Beijing, and Asian Development Bank Institute, ENU-WIDER. He has also served as a senior economic advisor to UNCTAD in Geneva and the Asian Development Bank in Manila. He has received his PhD, I think maybe the same year, I'm not sure, with Professor Gangopadhyay from the Cornell University, and his advisor was Professor Thorbecke. And he's worked a lot with Professor Thorbecke even after that, and I was very much impressed, and of course been influenced by one of their joint work, which was published in 1988. That was called Macroeconomic Effects and Diffusion of Alternative Technologies Within a Social Accounting Matrix Framework. That was a very interesting and very innovative and important book. Also, he has done, of course, a number of books, papers, etc., and many of them have been translated in many languages. Speaks the volume for his publication history. Professor Khan has received many prestigious awards, one of that being the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Academy of International Business, and he was invited to deliver the lecture in Davos in the US, apart from many other lectures that he delivered in Costa Rica, Mexico, Canada, Greece, Finland, I think all the countries. So, and last but not the least, he has another silent character, which I'm sure some of his friends and colleagues would know. He is an award-winning poet, a translator, and a literary critic. And he is also a singer. Okay, so that's his thing, and I'm also privileged to introduce Professor Gangopadhyay, who also has received his PhD from the University of Cornell in 1983. And after that, all of us know actually that he was at the Indian Statistical Institute until 2002. And soon after that, he started this idea and left ISI to become the founder director of IDEA. He was awarded also an honorary doctorate from the University of Gothenburg, Sweden in October 2006. He was the advisor to the Finance Minister, Government of India, for how many years? For one. And he was a member of the South Asia Chief Economics Advisory Council and the World Bank, a member of the board of Center for Analytical Finance, Indian School of Business, Hyderabad, and Bankruptcy Task Force, IPT, Columbia University, and the International Advisory Board of the Center for Law and Economics of Financial Markets. He is the founder president of the Society for the Promotion of Game Theory and its Application, and is the chief editor of the Journal of Emerging Market Finance, and is an associate editor of the Journal of Financial Stability, Elsevier, amongst many other distinguished activities that he has. These are only a few of them. I now request Professor Khan to make his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. After such a flattering introduction, it's really difficult to begin. So perhaps I should begin with the most famous person from Delhi from the 19th century. Although he was born in Agra, I think, Mirza Ghalib spent most of his time in Delhi. And in one of his ghazals, he says, "Dard minnat kashe dawana hua, maina acha hua, bura na hua." So I think my situation is like that. I have become neither good nor bad with time, and Shubhashish knows that probably very well indeed. I also remember a limerick, since Anushri made the mistake of introducing me also as a poet. I cannot resist quoting this limerick, which is not a great limerick, but I think it's quite to the point. There was a man named Besser. His knowledge grew lesser and lesser. At last, it grew so small that he knew nothing at all, and now he is a college professor. So, now I can speak. So I have changed the title a little bit. I have added China and East Asia. And the reason is that I think probably for this audience especially, the more general experience of East Asia is of some interest, of greater interest perhaps than just Korea. And China, of course, is now one of the BRIC, and India and China being so close in so many ways and yet so far apart in so many other ways. I think that could be an interesting comparison and contrast. But I think the basic points remain same, and I hope to some extent applicable with some modifications. And I have basically wanted here, taking this opportunity to synthesize some of my earlier work by myself and with some co-authors. I should mention the co-author of my most recent monograph on Chinese innovation system, Alberto Gabriele, who is in UNCTAD. And we are working on some other projects on China together. And I think it is also of some interest to me, at least, and I hope to people here, that out of the experience, complex experience of development and its successes and failures, the problems of both capitalism and socialism, we really have an opportunity to think more deeply and carefully about what I would call complex systems. Economy is, I think, one such system, an example of a complex system. And I will try to fit that into some of the practical concerns that we have when we talk about development. And before I go any further, I should also try to distinguish between at least three perspectives of time. We have first very short time period. By the way, I think classical political economists knew this very well. And since then we seem to have forgotten the distinction between very short time period, what might be called an intermediate time period, and then the very long time period, which historians like Fernand Braudel and the French analyst school would call longue durée, very long duration spanning centuries. I will talk mostly about the first two dimensions, but I think it would be interesting if anybody cares to, during the discussion period, to address the very long-run issues as well. And since I am also going to put some emphasis on ecological constraints and ecological aspects, unless we think about these things carefully, we may not have very much long of human history left anyway. So I think it becomes relevant in a way that it wasn't perhaps even 30 years ago. Okay, so I will be talking mainly about the challenges for industrialization and development. And I will be distinguishing between two periods during the post-World War II era. An earlier period which was relatively more optimistic, I think, than the current period. But of course, this is very broad brush kind of distinction, and we can talk about differences. I will also touch upon, although probably not elaborate, on the need for a more formal theory of complexities of development than we have been able to develop. We do have actually quite a bit of formal theory, but I would say that we do not have a complete theory yet. And out of that, perhaps we can analytically distinguish among different kinds of development strategies in the context of the kind of ecological constraints and other challenges that I briefly mentioned. So these two periods, I have described their characteristics here, and I will not go over them. But the second period in which we are, I think there are several things can be noted about that period. One is the demise of the Bretton Woods financial architecture. Just like our not having a nuclear war after Hiroshima, I think we have just been lucky since the demise of the Bretton Woods, that for a set of complex reasons which I need not go into right here, dollar has emerged as the key currency, but now it is teetering. And the world really has never been very stable for those who have looked below the surface of things. But now I think almost everybody can sense that the world, including the dollar, is no longer very stable, and we do need to address the question of financial architecture in the coming period very carefully and seriously. I will have more to say about many other things, but let me go through some preliminary conceptual aspects. We can distinguish at least among three concepts of development. One is basically growth as development, and although it's not a very deep idea, it has its relevance clearly. We do need growth. I'm not one of those ecological economists who think that growth per se is bad, especially for poor countries. I think that is not an acceptable proposition. For very rich countries, I think we can think about the kind of growth and other things carefully. But I think the proposition that I would submit would be that although growth is necessary even for poor countries and developing economies in general, we must ask seriously the question: what kind of growth? For whom is this growth going to be, etc. And from that second question, for whom? Really, we are led into distributional issues, and the second type of concept of development, the development as growth plus distribution, both inequality and poverty aspects. And third, the broadest concept is due to, of course, I will use his Bangla name, Amartya Sen. He was the first, following Adam Smith, as he himself was very quick to point out, to think of development as freedom and an extensive set of freedom, both negative freedom and positive freedom, to use the terminology that Isaiah Berlin popularized. Development as capabilities or freedom is, I think, a very important and an idea that can be quite useful if developed in the right way. What some people, including myself, have wanted to add to this, to the original formulation of Sen, has been the idea that this notion of capabilities has to be grounded in concrete social interaction and social economic and political institutions. This was an idea that was implicit and standing in tension with some of the more individualistic notions in sense original formulation of capabilities. But at least I have tried to think through this puzzle, and I was able to arrive at a point where the social and the individual aspects of capabilities can in fact be related in such a way that freedom becomes more of a Hegelian idea, that you need an interactive network of institutions in which the individual must function for the idea of freedom to make really any kind of coherent sense. So in that sense, both the neoclassical individualistic economics and the more classical or non-individualistic economics are somewhat short of the mark, and they have to be brought together in a coherent fashion. everything is coming twice so far, but maybe it will change. Okay, now if we look at the East Asian situation, which I think is still quite remarkable when we look back. But as I indicated before, the groundwork was really laid during the first optimistic period of both development economics and development practice. They were, in a way, major beneficiaries of Cold War rivalries, but so were many others, including Latin America. And Latin America did not get where East Asian economies got, and most East Asian economies had actually very few natural resources. They, of course, did have human resources, which they developed further. I tried to categorize them into 9 groups of factors. And I should hasten to add that this is by no means intended to be an exhaustive classification, but this is, I think, a classification that's a good starting point for our discussion and probably covers many of the important features that we would want to look at. So first is strategic openness. Openness just by itself may or may not be good, as people like Franz Liszt in the 19th century, who talked about the development of backward economies, in his case Germany, but even earlier, in case of America, the United States of America, that is, Alexander Hamilton and his 1790 report on manufactures, where he advocated a kind of protectionist trade policy and infant industries policy to further develop American industries. These are important historical documents, I think, for us to remember. But being closed and autarkic is not really possible for small economies, certainly. It's also not possible at the historical point where we are, even for very large economies like India or China or Brazil. So we have to think of openness as a necessity, but with some strategic foresight and insight. And I think this is where the East Asian experience is quite instructive. Many of the countries, starting with Japan, really found almost miraculously a way to avoid the dangers of autarky and also the dangers of hyper competition that could be quite destructive at earlier stages of development. And countries like Japan very sensibly, I think, ignored the advice of foreign experts who said that Japan could never have an automobile industry given the laws of comparative advantage, and they went their own way, essentially. And these are very complex economies and with very complex histories, and we can discuss specific issues during the question and answer period. But I think it is fascinating to study how they fashioned their openness in a strategic way. The second point is the heterodoxy in these economies in terms of macroeconomic policies. Again, starting with Japan. After the war, and even before the war, Japanese economic thinking was really dominated by German historical school. And after the war, Marxian economics also had a great influence, along with Keynesian economics. So you have great economists like Shigeto Tsuru and others who came from Tokyo University and were not academics, but fashioned the Japanese economic policy during the 50s, which was the crucial period and during which the high growth period of Japan started, at least since 1955. There you find again very heterodox thinking about macroeconomic policy, and no one-size-fits-all kind of prescription that IMF in particular started advocating in early 80s and apparently never changed until recently. But I think given the performance of IMF, especially during the Asian financial crisis, people are still reserving judgment about how much IMF is going to be able to change and how quickly. The third point is also very important, this creation of institutions for productive investment. And here I think role of institutions in development really stands out, because no developing country in history has started out with the requisite institutions. Every one of them had to, in a way, follow a kind of bootstrap strategy, building institutions. This applies just as much to, say, Holland, or even if you go back earlier to northern Italy, as to Britain and the late developers after Britain and the United States of America as well. So I think one of the tragedies of our training, I include myself in this, from 1980s on in US economics departments, has been the neglect of economic history, or even worse, teaching economic history through the lenses of neoclassical economic theory, and a very simplified form of neoclassical economic theory at that. Because good neoclassical economic theorists like Arrow or De Brue are so precise in their formulation of the neoclassical model that anybody with any degree of intelligence knows that the conditions are very stringent for the market economy to work in the way that most people think it works. So moving on, agricultural development, again, for a country like India, that is still a major issue. And in East Asian economic development, including Korea, history really helped them, because after the liberation, they were able to carry out land reform. Now, here too, history needs to be corrected a bit. US historians, both economic and non-economic, claim in general that it was because of American pressure that these countries were able to carry on land reforms. But the pressure really came from inside. All these countries have long histories of peasant struggles and people's organizations that formed even under severe repression and fought. In case of Korea, certainly they liberated themselves until they were unliberated again. That's a very complex history, I think, and I'll be happy to discuss that. But I do want to give credit to the people from these regions rather than to their American advisors, who did not always give them the right advice either, even at that period. Now, I think the next few items are really crucial: industrial development and structural change, and creation of technological capabilities, and technological learning and innovation. And later on, for China, I will try to go through this quickly, because I want to hear what my learned friend has to say there, and all of you. I'm here to learn, really. But these are so important, I think, that we need to put them on record, especially technological learning and innovation. And this is where the contrast between India and China, I think, is very useful to consider. But even a small country like Korea, or a small economy like Taiwan, in Asian Development Bank, we are always asked to call it Taipei, China. But since then, I have become an academic again, and I call it Taiwan. So the kind of innovation structure that they were able to create is simply amazing, I think. And one can learn a lot from the way that they have learned, and they are still trying to learn about innovation. And the last two items, again, they're all interesting and have many controversies and debates. FDI and foreign aid. In retrospect, actually, I think they both look to be much less important than they have been claimed to be. Of course, if you can attract FDI strategically, if you can use foreign aid strategically, they can be a very good thing. But there have been so much misallocation of investment in both these areas. And again, in societies which have been very much class-divided societies, caste-divided societies, with deep differences between the elites and the non-elites, between urban and rural population, etc., ethnic groups included. One has to be very careful about studying the impact of foreign aid and foreign direct investment. What is, again, very interesting about East Asia is that with the possible exception of China in case of FDI, the rest of East Asia basically developed without much FDI. Although foreign aid was involved and in infrastructure building, that has been quite important. In case of China, the use of FDI is something in which the state has played and continues to play a key role. And again, the evidence for China too is somewhat more mixed than one would imagine. But China certainly has been able to use FDI in a way that very few developing countries, in my experience at least, have been able to. And then poverty reduction strategies. Here I think, again, I have been quite opposed to the rhetoric of both the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, where I used to work, that somehow we should make poverty reduction the cornerstone of development, which is a good wish list. But ignoring the connection between poverty and other aspects of development or non-development, and ignoring things like infrastructure, energy, and other issues, I think at best is a very naive approach to development. It feels good, I know, because I live in America and I know a lot of American liberals and European liberals, but this feel-good thing is not what developing countries need. Developing countries need concrete projects that are going to be useful.
Where did you get this notion that that's what the World Bank is saying about poverty reduction?
You're not in the bank anymore. You're not in the bank.
No, still, this is intellectual discourse.
Sure. In 1999, of course, in December 1999, they enshrined this as an official policy.
So what's wrong with that, right?
What's wrong with that is, I would argue, and people like Yujiro Hayami, who are much more experienced in these things than I am, have argued that if this distracts us from...
That's one's limited bandwidth, right? If one has limited bandwidth and gets distracted by it.
Yes.
It's a nice catchphrase, right?
It's a very nice catchphrase, and these catchphrases are bought with a great deal of money, because in the US, public relations firms are not cheap.
We should not get into conspiracy.
No conspiracy. It's just the way the system works. If you can pay, you can find your phrases. Now, so again, I have done a lot of work on poverty. In fact, the book that I did before the one with Alberto is an edited book with John Weiss, who used to be the research director of Asian Development Bank Institute. It's called Poverty Strategies in Asia, and we have advocated what we call a growth plus strategies. Clearly we have to be mindful of the poor, but we should have a strategic approach and not simply a feel-good approach. Now, there are some features which are somewhat random and historically contingent. I think everybody knows this, so I will skip over these things. The basic point is that not only do we have some kind of general considerations, but every country is unique in some sense, but not so unique that we cannot do some careful and cautious generalizations. So this brings me to this complex adaptive systems models, and there are two approaches here formally that one can follow. One is to actually formulate a dynamic model in terms of difference or differential equations with elements of uncertainty built in. But they have to be nonlinear, and non-convexity is important because that leads us to the idea of multiple equilibria and choosing among them in some sense, or finding your place among them. And you can do things in various ways technically, and I will not go into them unless there is interest during question and answer period. But I have worked with several models, and what I have done, and there is some interest at NCAER in that because it has been a pioneer in the applied area in this field, is to use a sequence of social accounting matrices to show what kind of equilibrium sequence an economy has followed. and I've done this for Korea, and I've done this for Taiwan. So essential idea is that you formulate a mathematical model that can have multiple equilibria. In fact, it would be natural for such an economy to have multiple equilibria. And then in actual history, depending on what path was followed initially and other factors in each period, you will end up in a sequence of equilibria. And for some countries, like in East Asia, that sequence has been a good one on the whole, delivering both growth and at least a certain degree of equity. And for other countries, for many countries of Latin America, it doesn't seem to have produced the same thing. So I can go into the formal aspects later if people want, but right now I'll just go into Chinese case, because China is an interesting case. And again, as Sen and others have pointed out, China's development success actually in a way builds upon the more positive features of the Maoist period. There were of course many negative features during that period as well, we know, but there were many positive features in terms of human development, to use a short phrase to sum up several things. And the leadership from 1980s on was able to build on that. But they have become, of course, quite ambitious since 1995. And some people might think that China now poses a challenge to other developing countries. And in a short-run sense, again, that may be true, because the labor-intensive industries in China, we knew this even when we were at ADB. We were working on this in 1997, and together with Kibria and Rana Hassan, who is here now, and Anil Deolalikar, who is now in Riverside. At that time he was in Washington. We wrote a fairly big paper on problems of other countries in light of China attracting all the labor-intensive investment and exporting all the labor-intensive products. But China is much more than just labor-intensive products. I think that is the point I want to make during this talk. And again, this is basically a summary of the monograph that we did, so I will not take you through every little thing here. I want to wrap up soon. But China really has embarked on a very ambitious plan of this 15-year plan for innovation from 2006 to 2020. This is the time period. Now, both Alberto Gabrieli and I think this is too ambitious, although Alberto is, I think, more optimistic about China in this respect than I am. I think China will have a lot of problems and bottlenecks, and is already having many of these. But they have certainly grown very rapidly, and now they have even surpassed, since we wrote this, the 2% mark in R&D. And both the public sector and private sector are intensely involved in this, including everything from reverse engineering to setting up new institutions for science and technology research and applying these fruits of the research. But it is fairly contradictory, and I should mention in passing that Alberto and I also do not agree on the characterization of the overall economic and social formation of China. He thinks it is market socialist. I actually think that it is a strange but interesting type of capitalist society. And the Chinese national system of innovation, I think, can improve upon itself, not just in terms of efficiency, but also equity, and creating the kind of harmonious society that the current leadership has made into a slogan. And for that, again, I'm skipping for historical details, but I want to come to this okay. In the accumulation and technical progress of China, what we have done is to apply a kind of 21st century classical model, I should call it. One thing that, having studied in Presidency College, Shubhashish is quite familiar with this. There actually was a revolution in economic theory in 50s and 60s that got lost for many reasons. And Pasinetti, who was a student at Cambridge during, I think, late 50s, early 60s, has written a fascinating book laying the blame not just on power play by American neoclassical economists, but also on the arrogance and aloofness and other factors by the Cambridge left Keynesians themselves. It's very good, and if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that you do. But it is possible to maintain the key insights of classical political economy, but extend it in several different directions. One is to make it multi-sectoral in the way that I think Sraffa really has wanted it to be made. Second is to add demand to it in a meaningful way. And third is to make it dynamic in the way that the spirit of classical political economy really wanted it to be. So that's what I have done actually with the models that I earlier talked about. And if we do that, then in the innovation system itself, we can add, and I have changed my name for this. I wrote a book where I extended the idea of national innovation system to what I call positive feedback loop innovation system. Then I realized that wasn't a very descriptive term, so I have changed it lately to augmented national innovation system, ANIS. I think that's much better. But since I had this term in my older work, I have kept them, and I try to use both together now. And so what's the difference? The difference is that national innovation system theorists and practitioners basically look at efficiency and creation of innovation system either through creative destruction in the marketplace or through, and this is the more general approach, through a combination of efforts between the state and market. But it seems to have ignored distributional issues. So that is one point in which I have augmented the national innovation system idea. The other problem is what happens in terms of handling various contradictions that inevitably arise, contradictions, bottlenecks, the linkage issues between different sectors, the issue of forward linkages as well. So these also are issues that can be addressed and solved in the formal framework that I have been developing over the last 20 years. Finally, the issue of well-being of households, which is related to distribution but needs to be taken further by looking both at the consumption possibilities as well as the kind of capabilities enhancement that can take place through them. That is important. And of course here, without the pioneering work of Sen, I could not have really done anything. And finally, we also have to be much more careful about ecological issues. This is an aspect that also you do not find in classical political economy for reasons that I think we understand. Fortunately, a lot of work at the applied level had already been done by input-output people, but not all. So that still leaves some things for us to do. And if you extend the input-output framework to a social accounting matrix framework, again, you can include the household side in a much more disaggregated and careful way. So in these four respects, this augmented national innovation system truly, I think, augments the national innovation system. And that's where I believe China needs to move, and I would also argue that India needs to move. India is in a better shape, I think, than China, because there has been much more awareness in India throughout its post-independence history, and because of the relative openness of discussion in India. And again, not a perfect, far from perfect, in fact, I would say, but certainly much more democratic setting than the China situation. There has been and can be much more of an open debate in India on these issues, and I hope there will be. So let me quickly now move to the conclusions here. So we do need an alternative strategy, and this strategy, I have discussed this in a paper that is now in a book on China and India, one of the major problems with China, and I think this is to some extent true of India too, is that in this breakneck growth, energy use, especially fossil fuel energy use, has definitely outstripped the national production capacity, but also has had fairly grave environmental consequences, which are non-linear, and they will affect these societies in an accelerated manner unless mitigating efforts are undertaken. Of course, we hear a lot of talk, and there are plans of actions, but we need to carefully ask and evaluate what the results are and how we can make them happen sooner and more effectively. Question of distribution, well-being, creating the right kind of socioeconomic institutions, which are always in a state of evolution, of course, with a lot of tension and contradictions. Those have to be thought through very carefully. I think here too, India is in better shape, but not too much of a better shape than China. I'm afraid that China will face serious political crises along with environmental crises in the next 15-20 years. But Indian polity is also characterized by many stresses, all of which you know much better than I, and I hope to learn from you about the nature of those. But one thing that I think we can still maintain from East Asian experience is their focused effort. I do not think that intellectually, with the possible exception of Japan, the strength in East Asia has been greater than in South Asia. But what they did pragmatically and how they used their limited political and economic institutions and their resources, I think succeeded because of the kind of focus that they were able to master at various points of their development history. And that, I think, is something that we need to do. And I have this strange acronym there, FACE. By that I mean Foreign Aid Complementarity Elements. That aid by itself can do nothing if you do not have complementary elements domestically available with the aid. And that's why with actually relatively little aid, except as I said, infrastructure building, East Asian economies have been able to do a lot more because they mobilized precisely those domestic elements that could utilize foreign aid to almost an optimal level of effectivity. And I think it is necessary to acknowledge that politics is always going to be complex, no matter what society it is. And it doesn't help us just to blame politicians and say that we economists can always come up with the most optimal policy, and it's the fault of the politicians because they are too stupid or too self-interested, as if we are not, to do the right thing. I think we need at least a democratic forum for debate, discussion, dissemination, and appropriate political mechanisms for agenda forming and making the possibilities of following the right development strategy better. But it's always going to be fraught with uncertainty. There is no perfection in the realm of economic or any other kind of policy making. This is what I have learned from looking at the East Asian experience over several decades. And So we have to rethink also radically the informal sector, social capital, ecological aspects, gender awareness. Of course, Anushri here has done a lot of important work, and a lot of our colleagues. I think here work done in developing countries, to me, has been a lot better than work done by feminists in developed countries. I respect them for many reasons, but I think they are very naive when it comes to thinking about gender issues even in developing countries. Again, like their male counterparts, they seem to have this blueprint of a perfect world, and they think all they need to do is to advocate the right policies and things will happen. Of course, one can question if they are the right policies and if just advocacy will make them happen. And finally, because I am now an academic again, I want to advocate some other kinds of modeling that will get us, I think, to think more realistically about how decisions are made. And one of them is bounded rationality, that we don't have perfect rationality. We are bounded in many ways. The idea is to find the right formal language, or approximately right formal language, and some of us have been doing that. And this neuro-fuzzy learning, I think, is very important, and neural network and fuzzy set theory can be brought together to form some preliminary models, I should emphasize, to characterize learning in a complex environment. Well, I will stop right here, and thank you for being so patient and listening to me.
Thank you, Haider, and I think I'll now request Professor Gangapathy to make his comments on the paper for 10 to 15 minutes, all right?